Just got the thumbs up. We will begin. Thank you for being here this morning. Welcome to CSIS, and we appreciate you being here bright and early on a Monday morning for this important event. My name is Scott Miller. I'm a senior advisor and hold the William Scholl Chair in International Business at CSIS. This morning's event is a production of three CSIS programs working cooperatively. The Program for Prosperity and Development and the Americas program. So we welcome you, to those of you who made it over here. We appreciate that effort. For those of you online, we welcome you. And if you're interested in the rebroadcast of this event, it will be posted on the event page at csis.org immediately following the program. There is a lot of programming in this city on NAFTA, and no surprise to any of you who follow this. So we are genuinely delighted that you came and invested your time, voted with your feet to come to our event. So thank you for doing that. We have an excellent lineup today to talk about a subject that we hope will provide context, but our programs are doing that on a regular basis. So we urge you to follow CSIS programs, whether it's the Americas program, the Scholl Chair, or our trade website, Trade Vistas, for continuing coverage of the NAFTA. To get things started, I'd like to introduce my colleague, Deputy Director of the Americas Program and Director of the Mexico Program, Richard Miles. Richard.
Thank you, Scott, and again, welcome to CSIS. I am Richard Miles, the Director of the U.S.-Mexico Futures Initiative. And you may wonder why we will have a stage full of ambassadors here talking about a possible NAFTA doomsday scenario. And the way I see it is it's really the job description of an ambassador to see the big picture, the whole relationship. And so as we wanted to look really beyond trade just by itself and examine what could happen to the other strategic issues involved in these bilateral relationships if indeed the United States or one of the parties exits NAFTA. So I expect that we'll probably hear about things like security cooperation with Mexico, about defense cooperation with Canada, about cooperation with both countries on regional issues like Venezuela or Haiti, about global issues like cybersecurity, health, and others. And then most importantly, Canada and Mexico are our neighbors, so I think there's the people-to-people relationships angle that ambassadors care a lot about, cultural ties, educational ties, and of course things like immigration. To start this off, we're going to have another ambassador, Carla Hills, set the stage for us. And Carla is one of those people in Washington say needs no introduction, but I'm going to go ahead and give her one anyway. Ambassador Hills was born in Los Angeles, attended Stanford, Oxford, and then Yale Law School. She started her career as Assistant U.S. Attorney in Los Angeles, later became Assistant Attorney General of the Civil Rights Division at Department of Justice. During the Ford administration, she was the Secretary of Health and Urban Development. And of course, under the George H.W. Bush administration, she was the U.S. Trade Representative, during which time she led the negotiations for the North American Free Trade Agreement. So it would be hard to find a better person in Washington to speak about what NAFTA has achieved and what the world could look like without it. So please join me in welcoming Ambassador Carla Hills.
Thank you, Richard. Well, we've got a great panel, so I'm going to be very brief. I think in starting to think about what we lose from a pullout of the NAFTA, we ought to remember what did the agreement do for us? And so let me briefly say it brought together 490 million consumers and created a $19 trillion market. It eliminated tariffs on all industrial goods and most agricultural goods, except for a few, were with Canada. It opened a broad range of services, including financial services, and provided national treatment for our service providers across line. It removed significant investment barriers and provided protection for our North American investors, and it provided enforceable protection for trademarks, patent rights, and copyright, which have become more important in these 20 years since. And as a result, our commercial relationships throughout North America expanded, making this region the most competitive in the world. Today, Canada and Mexico account for 1/3 of our global trade, but we're not to talk about trade. We're talking about what happens if it shrinks. And actually, I want to also mention that Canada is our largest export destination and Mexico is our second largest. And the number of and vibrancy of these commercial relationships have created bonds, great bonds, people to people and government to government, paying dividends in areas way beyond trade. For example, visitors from Canada and Mexico constitute the top 2 sources of tourism, a major industry for the United States. In 2015, contributed $1.5 trillion to our economy. Today, 1 out of 9 jobs are hinged to tourism. A decrease in tourism has already occurred in this year as a result of concerns about the breakdown in our regional relationship. Another cost from withdrawal would be a decrease in inward investment. Our NAFTA partners have invested $280 billion in the United States, and the uncertainty created by the threat of our walking away from the agreement after 24 years, without question, will reduce interest in investments and jobs connected to investments, and not just from our northern and southern neighbors, much more broadly. Uncertainty with respect to our future action also affects our job creation. And think of it, in 1993, our jobs connected to Mexico totaled 700,000. Today, as a result of the NAFTA, it's 5 million. Exiting from the NAFTA would obviously cause that number to shrink very significantly. And you take the auto sector. We would lose jobs if we break up our highly synchronized supply chains that have made our auto industry the most competitive globally. After a pullout, our companies would see their costs increase, adversely affect their global competitiveness, and result in a decrease in our sales, which would mean fewer jobs. Some companies might, and are predicted to, relocate to Asia, which again would adversely affect jobs. Or take the agricultural sector. We've got 10 states that are keenly related to what they produce in the agricultural markets. And the tariffs, then the food sector, the bound tariffs, are above 30%. So our farm states would truly feel the pinch. In addition to the harm done to our regional relationship, we would suffer challenges in maintaining security. For the past 2 decades, our 3 governments have worked together to handle the increased flow of trade, trying to separate the ways to those items that would create a danger, and so they could focus on facilitating those items which there is no concern. And today we share intelligence and collaborate on confronting challenges running from narcotics to international crime, to various areas of organized crime, and creating a stronger border requires attention and action on both sides of a border. And pulling out of NAFTA would most assuredly erode the partnerships in dealing with a broad range of security issues. And finally, I have no doubt that an exit from the NAFTA would result in serious leadership erosion for our government, not only with our 2 neighbors, but throughout the hemisphere and beyond. To turn our back on an important agreement with our neighbors over concern about bilateral deficits raises questions with respect to our reliability and our leadership. What other government would want to sit down and negotiate on any topic? A concern would loom that we could not be relied upon to deliver tomorrow what we promised today. And we have a great panel to talk about in greater detail the costs and consequences of exiting from the NAFTA. So I will exit the podium and turn it over to our great panel, and I thank you for being here.
Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you for being here. My name is Romina Bandura. I'm a senior fellow here at CSIS, and I'll be moderating this panel. What a treat to have three former ambassadors here today. Ambassador Earl Anthony Wayne is a former U.S. ambassador to Mexico from 2011 to 2015. Ambassador Arturo Sarucan, he's former Mexican ambassador to the United States from 2007 to 2013. And Ambassador Michael Wilson, he's the former Canadian ambassador to the United States from 2006 to 2009. So we're going to talk about the consequences of NAFTA beyond trade, but of course we can talk about trade as well. I'd like to start with, putting this topic more to the level of a regular citizen. How do you think regular citizens would be affected by an exit of NAFTA? What do you tell a regular Joe? How does that impact them? And we can start with Ambassador Wayne.
Sure. Thanks very much. Well, I think the basic message is that things would cost more. Cars could cost a couple $1,000s more if we went out of our North American production chain. The winter vegetables you get from Mexico would probably cost a little bit more, maybe not be as available. We don't know what will happen in agricultural trade. So day to day, that would probably be the place that people note things. Mm-hmm. In general, I think we would also see, and we'll talk about this a little bit more, we'd see a reduction in security cooperation in fighting crime. And that's already that crosses the border. That's already a serious problem that both sides are working together now very collaboratively on. And as we can talk a little bit about more often, I think that cooperation would be negatively impacted if the U.S. were to exit NAFTA.
Good morning, and thank you for having us this morning. This is an important week as the so-called intersessional meeting before round 6 in Canada at the beginning of next year kicks off. So we'll be seeing a lot of discussions as to some of the hot button issues, whether it's rules of origin or sunset clauses or some of these issues that are bedeviling the conversations. And the one issue that I would add to Tony's list of sort of how it impacts the daily lives of Americans is cost of cars. If the U.S. were to impose some of the issues that it would like to impose on rules of origin and the automotive sector, there will be a very important impact on the price of automobiles manufactured in North America. At the end of the day, I think it's a hard question because if you look at the 2016 presidential campaign, this was a campaign that was won not on public policy debates or discussions, but on narrative and storytelling. So how do you transform very compelling data, despite that we seem to live in a fact-free Washington these days? How do you translate all of these numbers and all of this data into something that connects with Americans? One of the ways I think that helps is to continue to underscore that there's no bilateral relationship on the face of the earth that touches the daily lives of so many Americans in the relationship with Mexico. And yes, it's the avocados that you buy, but it's also what happens with scarce water resources on either sides of the border, certainly what Mexico and the United States have been doing in terms of security collaboration, whether it's regional or extra-hemispheric. But there is a very compelling story to be told. The problem is how do we distill all of those numbers and create storytelling that will connect with your average Joe to underscore how important this is. One of my hopes is that given that one of the sectors that would be severely hurt by the denunciation of NAFTA by the U.S. administration, which is the ag sector, this will provide a real pinch in states that elected President Trump, profoundly red states, agricultural states, that would lose significantly if this disappears. So I think, and we can go into some of the specifics of all of this, which I'm sure that we will do in the panel. But at the end of the day, I think the challenge that we have as former officials and think tanks and policymakers is how do we create a narrative which connects to the average citizens in Canada, Mexico, and the United States as to what the impact of NAFTA going south, pun intended, would entail for the daily lives, security, prosperity, and well-being of North Americans.
A lot has been said. I'll try not to repeat it, but in agriculture and cars and textiles, those are the three sectors that would be most severely affected. And those are three sectors that the average Joe or Jane will feel quite directly. A little bit less directly, there's an uncertainty of what's going to happen after NAFTA and what's going to happen if we have no NAFTA and there's nothing to replace it with. That's going to affect investment. Investment creates jobs. So there will be an indirect effect very clearly on jobs. If all of this happens the way that we've been discussing, I would be concerned about an anti-American sense in both Mexico and Canada that is going to be damaging for the relationship among all of our countries. We just don't need that, and I think it's something that we have to be concerned about. The final point I'll make is that 35 states have as their number one export destination is Canada, and I think that there's a number of the other states is with Mexico, and the number two in both cases is usually Mexico or Canada. So it's not just here in Washington, it will be felt throughout the United States, those negative impacts that the three of us have talked about.
Thank you very much. Now I'd like to focus more on the security aspects. So the three countries have cooperated in border issues, drugs, and other, illegal immigration. How would exiting impact those three areas? Drug cooperation, immigration, especially from Central American countries, and potential terrorist threats. Those are key issues that citizens care about.
I think a good place to start is precisely where Mike left off, which is because it bleeds into a lot of these issues, which is perceptions, and you don't need to be Kissinger to figure out why. Of all the countries surveyed in a recent Pew poll, the country where positive, favorable perceptions of the United States have collapsed the most is Mexico. Favorable perceptions went from 66 to 33 in a year. And people may say, well, how does that impact the relationship? Well, when you've got a presidential election in Mexico in less than 8 months, and you see what Mexicans are being polled and what they're being asked, and there's a key question which I would like to put right next to this collapse in favorable perceptions, which is when you ask Mexican citizens whether the Mexican administration is dealing adequately with the Trump administration, overwhelming majority, 63, 62% say that the Mexican government isn't responding adequately to the US administration. So imagine what the negative perceptions and this poll tell you about the maneuverability that a Mexican government has to do stuff with the United States as Mexico heads into the political electoral cycle of next year. And it impacts everything from what we do on a day-to-day basis in terms of our southern border with Guatemala and Belize. It has a profound impact on security collaboration, something that Tony and I worked on hand in hand when he was in Mexico City and I was in Washington, D.C. And there's already a challenge because as the U.S., and this is not the forum to discuss whether we agree or we don't agree, whether we think it's a good thing or a bad thing, but as the U.S. has moved domestically in a de facto legalization of cannabis, there are many in Mexico who are increasingly saying, why should Mexico be investing its Churchillian quota of blood, toil, sweat, and tears in whacking weeds and eradicating marijuana if 9 states in the United States have now legalized cannabis for recreational use? So there's already a tension there that's relevant. And if to this you add a U.S. administration that decides to invoke Article 2205 of NAFTA and denunciate the agreement, it's going to have a profound impact on how Mexico has articulated a number of policies, whether it's the regional, bilateral, or hemispheric level. And it's not that necessarily Mexico will become an anti-American country. It's simply the maneuverability and the ability to do stuff that we have been doing for the past decade and a half on issues like security would go out the window. I'll give you a very prescient example. Given now that immigration was one of the third rails of the GOP primary, it has played such an important role in these months, and we have the decision over what happens with the Dreamers in DACA. When the famous Gang of 8 bill was being developed on Capitol Hill, which later was approved in the Senate and then failed in the House, some of you who follow these issues closely remember there was debate over what was called a touchback clause. The idea was, what do you do with 11 million undocumented immigrants who were in the United States to allow them to become, to legally be in the United States? And so there was a discussion on Capitol Hill as to how you would make these 11 million people leave the country and then come back legally to be able to then start whatever process of immigration legalization was put on the table for them. And Mexico at the time told Congress, we would be willing to take in, because one thing is Mexicans or Central Americans who are relatively close, but if you're from India or China or Poland, go back and then come in, it's a bit of a challenge. So Mexico said, we would be willing to take in 11 million people if you can process them in 48 hours across the border in Mexican consulates, and then we would allow them to cross back into the United States, and that way we can help in ensuring that those individuals who are in the country without papers can come back in with a legal status so that we can get that issue off the table. That debate, which was happening in 2010, 2009, today, in the current circumstances, despite how important it would be to be able to help move the needle forward on the domestic immigration debate in the United States, is off the table. No one, it would be political suicide for anyone in Mexico today to put that on the table. So that's an example of how this use of Mexico as a political electoral piñata added to the potential of NAFTA going down the drain because of a unilateral denunciation, how this could impact a lot of the stuff that we've been doing together on mill-to-mill cooperation, on counter-narcotics, on regional security, on challenges that we're facing in the Caribbean and in South America, where we have been working hand in hand.
Good. Just to finish on that one a little, and then maybe please talk about Canada. It's important to remember that in the 1980s, the United States and Mexico were called distant neighbors. And that's because they really didn't cooperate on very much. There were individual friendships, but there wasn't a cooperative relation between the two governments. After NAFTA, what happened over the subsequent 25 years is gradually, and let me underscore gradually, we developed more mutual trust and mutual understanding, and we started expanding the area where we were able to cooperate. It started in the trade and then financial area. Arturo and I wrote a paper about in the foreign policy area how long it took. It took up through the first decade of the 2000s and then beyond to get us to a point where we were willing to look at collaborating around the world and in other places. And the same is true in the security area. There was just not mutual trust or mutual understanding between the security agencies. They would work together on specific cases, but it was limited. And the same thing on the border. Up until just a few years ago, people were still shouting at each other across the border.
Finger pointing.
Pointing fingers. And what they did is they moved to a shared paradigm of shared responsibilities. We share the responsibility for solving these really difficult problems. Neither of us can do it by ourselves. In the law enforcement security area, starting in 2008 with the Merit Initiative and moving forward, increasingly every year there was better collaboration. They didn't solve all the problems, but they found new ways to address those problems that were more effective. A lot of that is endangered by what Arturo was talking about, the public attitudes in both countries really, but also in Mexico, where you just don't have the space to do those kind of steps forward, and your own law enforcement people are going to be less trustworthy because of what they perceive to be clear insults, not against the criminals, but against Mexico in general and against the Mexican people in general. And so the big danger here is we're going to see significant steps backward. And the most worrisome part of it to me is that the NAFTA generations, the young Mexicans who grew up in NAFTA, who came to see real values in the United States that they admired, are now changing their opinions. Now, and that's evident in that overall poll, but it's evident in what I'm sure Arturo and I have both heard from our friends who say, my kids are coming to me and they're really, really critical of the United States now. And they just have a whole different attitude. It's like they're pulling out the old views that were held by me when I was younger or by my parents, this is the Mexicans talking, of the United States. And that's just not the kind of relationship we want to have with a neighbor.
I think Tony has said something that is very, very important. What NAFTA has done has brought our three countries together, not just Mexico and the United States, but also Canada, Mexico, and the United States. After a NAFTA termination, that will dissipate, no question of that. So we are concerned about that, not to the same extent because we aren't so as directly as affected, but we are concerned about a dissipation of the strong relationship that is built over the last 25 years between between Mexico and the United States. The other point, it's a broader point here, what's the message to the rest of the world? If the United States can't get along with their two neighbors, Mexico and Canada, and they have to destroy a trade agreement which has done tremendous positive results for all three countries, if they can't get together with their two neighbors, how are they going to be able to get together with other countries in other parts of the world? And Carla made that point a little bit earlier on a trade agreement with another country. How can you count on the United States? So I think there's that effect. The third point I'd make is on border management. When I was ambassador, it was after 9/11, and one of the real challenges that we had was border management. And if there is a breakdown in the attitudes towards managing a border in a positive way, we're going to get affected in Canada almost as much as it would affect Mexico. So that's something that I think that we've got to be concerned about as well. Final point, in 2011, President Obama and Prime Minister Harper launched something, I think it's Beyond the Borders was the name of the negotiation. Anyway, it would focus on border management and harmonization of regulation. And a lot of that was done very quietly below the radar screen, but a lot of good things has come out of that over the course of this time. I would worry that the momentum that we had that arose from that 2011 agreement would decline, and possibly we might see things in reverse. So not as direct an impact between Canada and the United States as between the United States and Mexico, but certainly we would not be immune from the concerns that have been expressed by Arturo and Tony.
Thank you. My other question is, Ambassador Sarukan, you mentioned, you know, we have Mexican elections in July. How would this process be, I mean, the NAFTA exit impact democracy and you know, human rights and all those issues if U.S. pulls out?
Let's see, because I've seen a lot written about this, and some of it is a bit of a gobbledygook. Let's be clear, the Mexican election will not be won or lost depending on what happens on NAFTA. Not even this country determines its electoral outcomes based on foreign policy issues, with a couple of exceptions. But it will have an impact in the sense of attitudes and opinions, which we've talked about. And it will have an impact because then there will be the question of who lost NAFTA, which will be utilized electorally. But I don't think, regardless of whether NAFTA is still alive by the time Mexicans go to the polls on July the 1st, or whether it has already been denunciated by the president by then, I don't think Mexicans will go to the polls and cast their vote depending on what has happened with NAFTA. The drivers will be impunity, corruption, public insecurity. Those will be the accountability. Those will be the main drivers based on which Mexicans will decide who they choose as their next president. So there isn't a direct correlation between what happens with NAFTA and the result on July the 2nd. But it will have an impact in terms of attitudes and perceptions and the space, the bandwidth with which this government until December the 1st, remember we've got this horrendously long transition that goes from July 1st to December the 1st, so we'll have a lame duck president for almost 5 months, and president-elect at the same time. And this will be a very difficult moment to articulate forward-looking policies, even in the best of worlds, regarding a strategic relationship like the one we have with the United States. If NAFTA is no longer there, then imagine the complications that will trigger as the new government starts to devise its policies towards the U.S. Where I think the collapse, the derailment of NAFTA does play a very important role is an issue where most Americans usually don't stop and think about, which is that NAFTA in Mexico had an impact beyond the trade agenda. Yes, our trade to the United States quadrupled. Yes, we support 5 million U.S. jobs directly in U.S. states that are linked to NAFTA. Yes, we're your second largest buyer of exports after our Canadian colleagues. All the numbers are there and point to what a resounding trade success NAFTA has been for the two-way bilateral relationship. But in terms of Mexico, NAFTA also had a profound institutional footprint in terms of rule of law, in terms of predictability, in terms of investment, in terms of how the country became much less autarkic than it was before NAFTA was negotiated, in the way Mexico linked its destiny to the United States in terms of economic and trade prosperity. It created a level playing field for U.S. businesses and U.S. investment in Mexico. It anchored many of the changes that we have seen in Mexico. In fact, some of the policies that are being articulated by this administration hark back to how Mexico would manage its economy before NAFTA was approved. So in many ways, there's a larger institutional footprint that NAFTA has developed in Mexico, which might be lost, and where the certainty regarding investments and business footprints, I can mention one big area where this is critically important, energy. Because when we negotiated NAFTA back in 1991, Carla and Mike will remember this, the US and Mexico each vetoed one issue that our two respective countries put on the table. Mexico wanted to talk about labor mobility, which continues to haunt the relationship as it fits into the larger immigration debate, and the US said no can do. And the US wanted to put energy on the table, and Mexico said no can do, not only because we weren't ready to do that, but because Mexico's internal domestic laws were such that you couldn't have private domestic or foreign investment in the energy field. What has happened in the last years as to the energy reform in Mexico and the impact that this has for the North American energy footprint in terms of efficiency, security, independence, if NAFTA's lost, you lose. If you're a U.S. oil major or a transnational oil major, you lose a lot of legal certainties in the Mexican marketplace if NAFTA disappears. So it is about trade, but in the case of Mexico, where there's still asymmetries between the rule of law and transparency and accountability with our two North American partners, this has had a very important effect which could be lost if NAFTA were to disappear.
So just to add to that, it will, if the U.S. pulls out of NAFTA before the election, it will change the tenor of the debate. The estimates are that Mexico could lose anywhere between 900,000 and 1.2 million jobs if NAFTA were ended. That is going to be something candidates will have to take a position on. They're going to have to change that agenda. And if jobs rise up in the agenda and people are fearful about the future of their economy, that means other things will be relatively less important. I think Arturo's right that those main anti-corruption themes are going to be right up there in front, and then I think violence and crime in the country. But you're going to have next to it a whole different debate about what do you do about the future economy of Mexico? How quickly can you develop new export sources? What impact is this going to be? To have on Mexican citizens, and you're not going to have anybody championing cooperation with the United States. Even those candidates who personally might believe that, they're just not going to have the space to do that. And those who may personally not believe it anyway will be a bit more aggressive and nationalistic in their response because you're protecting your electorate, you're protecting your Mexican citizens.
I'm not going to talk directly about the U.S. Or the Mexican election because others have commented on it before. But what I would say is that if the things arise that both Arturo and Tony have talked about, that is going to raise uncertainty about investment into Mexico by Canadians. And one of the things that's happened in the last few years that was slow in coming was Canadian investment into Mexico. And I would hate to see that slow down because we're just getting a degree of momentum, and a number of investments or potential investments are related to the energy reform that has taken place. And if there's any slowdown or reversal of that, then that type of investment will stop. One of the great areas of potential for the three countries working together is in the energy area. If we could ever get to a region-wide energy policy, it would put this region, the North American region, in a very strong position. We would be self-sufficient in oil, in natural gas, in electric power, nuclear power, and be really the model for the rest of the world. And that's something that I would be very concerned about. We wouldn't be able to achieve that if we had some setback electorally in Mexico. So uncertainty related to the Mexican political scene is not going to be good for a very wide range of reasons, and we've already touched on that in earlier comments.
I'd like to add to what Mike has just said here, because a lot of this conversation has been sort of gravitating around either the U.S.-Mexico axis or the Canada-U.S. axis, even though Mike obviously has just mentioned some of the impact this could have in terms of the Mexican-Canadian relationship. But there's a larger picture at play here, which is what an implosion of NAFTA does to a common North American footprint worldwide, and what it does to the ability of the three North American partners to compete geostrategically and economically in the 21st century vis-a-vis China. If there's so much agitation these days about what China means and entails for U.S. national security, foreign policy, economic policy, I'm convinced that the 21st century can be a North American century if we get this renegotiation right, if we end up modernizing and revamping NAFTA to 21st century standards. This is what allows North America, paired with what has happened in the energy sector, both in terms of the energy revolution in Canada and the United States, and what has happened because of Mexico's decision to open up its energy sector. If you add energy to this template, you suddenly have the potential of the 21st century truly being a North American century in terms of our ability to compete with Asia Pacific, particularly with China. So there's a much larger piece here, and there's also something which has been very dear to my heart, which I work with both my Canadian and US friends, which is how do we deepen the security collaboration between the three countries at a regional and global level? How do we engage on issues that matter to us, where we have coincidental agendas in the hemisphere, whether it's disaster relief and collaboration to respond to Central America or to the Caribbean? We had started to discuss, for example, the pre-positioning of material and equipment and troops, and to be able to respond quickly to natural emergencies in the Caribbean and the Central American regions. Mexico has finally moved into PKOs after decades of keeping peacekeeping operations at UN at arm's length. We did it because we started the slow process of engaging with our Canadian friends, where there were less, for historical reasons that all of you will understand, there were less antibodies to working on PKO issues with our Canadian friends than with our US friends. But this allowed us, during my tenure, to finally bring Navy and Army liaisons to NORTHCOM in Colorado Springs. There's a whole debate of if one day Mexico should, and I think it should, become a member of NORAD. But this discussion that has been slowly moving forward in ways that would have been unthinkable 20 years ago is something that North America could lose, and which would, I think, be to the detriment of the strategic interests of the region going forward.
Let me just pick up on Arturo's mentioned China and the North American region versus the Asia/China region. We also have the competition of the third major economic region in the world today. If the United States is thinking strategically here, the main challenge economically, in trade, finance, other related issues, is not Mexico, not China, not Canada, but it's going to be China. China is where the main challenge is going to come. So let's look at the major sector that the United States is targeting in this renegotiation of NAFTA, the automotive sector. The deficit or the surplus that Mexico has in auto and parts is about 80% of the deficit, or the surplus, however you want to look at it. So that's a major focus, and something has to be done to address that. But let's be careful about addressing that. China has a car production today, a car and small truck production of 28 million vehicles. North America, the three countries, it's slightly over 20 million. So they have the capacity to move into this market where they have not moved to date. I've just come back from a couple of weeks over there, and it's very clear that China is targeting to come into the North American market, primarily the U.S. market, within 5 years. And they have the capacity to do that, and they are developing the technology. Quality isn't quite there now, but if you go back to Japan 20, 30 years ago and Korea 15 years ago, we said the quality isn't there now. But what do we see? We see a lot of Japanese, a lot of Korean cars. I happened to pick up a copy of the South China Morning Post. And what caught my eye was this. This is, I looked at it and I said, that looks like a Corvette. And I looked a little bit more close and I said, well, that's a pretty splashy, fancy car. And I read a little bit further. It's not a Corvette, it's a Chinese car. It's reputed to be the fastest electric car in the world today. China has, we read all about Tesla, China has 43% of the global market for electric vehicles. So that is the basis on which they're going to come into this market. So here we are in this negotiation, we're trying to weaken the North American automotive production. This, as you've heard from others earlier today, is drawn together by the supply chain, the North American supply chain, where the best of the United States, of Canada, and Mexico is brought together to make this a very competitive region. We should be looking at how we can strengthen this North American region against the challenges from both Europe and China, rather than weakening it in that major competitive auto production area. So we've got to get away from the the small scale wins that we're going to get at that we're trying to get at the negotiating table, and get our minds on the strategic level, where it is extraordinarily important that we work together as three countries to be able to address the competition which is bound to come from Asia, and for Asia, read China, because they are the dominant country over there, obviously. That's where we have to be, and have a strategic overview guiding these negotiations, as opposed to a transactional approach at the negotiating table.
Thank you, Ambassador. That's a great segue for my last question. How do you visualize a modern NAFTA? What are the, what's the best alternative to, we've talked about exit, but let's be positive. What are those elements that we need to strengthen to be a big North American bloc?
Well, I think taking up Michael's comments, what we need to do is focus throughout this negotiation on the future issues that are going to make countries more competitive or not. And rather than looking backward to the economies of the past, how is industry going to transform over the next 10 and 15, 20 years? And how do we make sure the rules that we write in this new NAFTA are flexible and open enough to take care of these kind of changes? Right now, we're trying to catch up with the last 20 years on data, on e-services, on all sorts of things that weren't happening when NAFTA was written. But we have to leave that space for what's coming. What we know is that all economies in the world are going to be hit by these waves of new technology. We're going to have workers who have, if they don't lose a job, they're going to have part of their job redefined. So how do we work together to have that space be open for workforce development in all three countries? How do we have the space there for new services? How do we encourage R&D that will, in fact, compete with China in the future? And not just China, with Germany and Japan, because if you look at them, they also have these regional models that help them produce things competitively. And so it really is about strategic vision, not very narrow, specific vision. There is a place for fixing things in the trade agreements that haven't worked. But the opportunity is creating a trade agreement that will take us 20 years into the future and serve all three of these economies well. And if I can just add, and that's sort of the same thing on the security front also, the vision for a lot of people at the height of this collaboration was extending security to and beyond North America because of the cooperation between the three countries. You're not just thinking your national borders, you're thinking how collaboratively can we expand this security look to other areas, and not just border areas, but who's coming in? How can we work together to keep terrorists, to keep radicals, to keep others out? And that was really the potential of where we were going. And it was transforming borders, both between the U.S. and Canada and the U.S. and Mexico, in their very nature, to make them a creative place where you're providing security, but you're facilitating all that good traffic, and you're doing it in the context of a network of information sharing that really lets you know who's coming and going. And that vision is also endangered if we move back to an isolated idea of the three countries sort of getting along with each other, but not really taking advantage of all the potential that's there.
I think the sine qua non to coming up with an upgraded 2.0, 3.0 free trade agreement is to jettison the my way or the highway approach to negotiations and the zero-sum mechanics with which this administration has approached most of the issues in the negotiation itself. You have to get rid of sunset clauses. It's absurd. A sunset clause runs counter to why you have a free trade agreement in the first place. You're not going to sign a free trade agreement if every 5 years, and if you're a company and you're going to invest, you're not going to do it if every 5 years you're going to have to renegotiate the agreement. So you've got to get rid of the sunset clause, and you should do no harm. You should do no harm to the joint supply and production platforms that we've created in North America, which have allowed us to compete and which have ensured that not more jobs have been lost in the American heartland. It also means that we do what we were trying to do with TPP. TPP, when Canada and Mexico decided to join TPP, at the end of the day, the reason why Canada and Mexico joined was that this was the best way to upgrade NAFTA without having to renegotiate NAFTA, because by adhering to 21st century standards on stuff that didn't exist when we negotiated NAFTA, Tony has mentioned it, e-commerce and digital and IPR and biotech issues. By modernizing TPP and having Canada, Mexico, and the United States be TPP members, it would have automatically renewed the regulatory framework with which we trade without having to even say NAFTA and renegotiate in the same sentence. The fact that many of the disciplines that negotiators are looking at today come from the TPP itself, I think is an indication of what a modernized, upgraded free trade agreement between the three countries that improves our ability to compete looks like. So I think this is very important on the issue that Tony has mentioned. And Mike, trade facilitation. The paradigm is not a wall, it's membranes. Membranes allow the good stuff to come in and filter the bad stuff out. We have the ability to do this, not only in terms of what our security and intel agencies have been doing together since 9/11, despite what you hear on the campaign trails, the collaboration that has occurred between Mexico, the United States, and Canada post 9/11 in terms of passenger verification, ensuring that no one who has been denied a visa can shop for a visa in Canada or Mexico and enter the North American space. North American common domain awareness is a very important piece of all of this. So all of these are pieces of a puzzle that, if brought together, could really upgrade and modernize our trilateral relationship. So all I would probably end up by saying is that Oscar Wilde used to say that when the gods wish to punish us, they listen to our prayers. In an Americanized version of that, it's basically be careful what you wish for. And I think the administration has to be very careful what it's wishing for on the NAFTA front because of the profound economic, trade, and national security dislocating effects it can have on the trilateral relationship as a whole.
What should a modern trade agreement look like? I think the basics of approaching a trade agreement among three countries who are friends, allies, neighbors, is to look at the broad region and then identify what can be done in the critical sectors. We've talked about energy, we've talked about digital, we've talked about automotive. And transportation is another area. And then decide how can we best design a trade agreement that looks at the strengths of the three countries in these key areas, and how do we put together a trade agreement that allows them, those various sectors, to work more closely together to develop a strong national or strong North American region. And that I think is the big challenge. I think there's another point here. The whole focus of the administration has been on the trade deficit. Economics 101 will tell us that a trade deficit is not based on a specific trade agreement here or with whatever other country. It is based on the structure of the U.S. economy. The U.S. economy has a high federal government deficit, high consumer spending, 70% of GDP as opposed to 60% in most other comparable companies. That produces a low savings rate and an automatic current account deficit, the trade deficit being a significant part of that current account deficit. So we've got to realize that hammering away at one country or another country on a trade agreement such as NAFTA is not going to solve the U.S. trade deficit. It's a red herring. It's something that the United States has had for 40, 45 years now. So it's not going to happen. It's not going to be resolved just by making a change to NAFTA. Structurally, there has to be a change, and that will be extraordinarily difficult. The thing that I worry about the most on this is that if we revert to the old ways of let's have a trade negotiation where I'm going to hammer you, you're going to hammer me, and we each try to get a win at the table. The implications of this, or the messaging that this extends to the World Trade Organization and any future discussions around that table, is very negative. We've got to be looking at trade in a positive way. And if our three countries can't work together to find that more modern way forward, it sends a very negative message to members of the WTO.
Thank you very much. We have about 20 minutes for Q&A from the audience, so I'll take two questions. Please identify yourself. The lady here and the lady over there. Yes, there's the microphone.
Thank you. Patricia Scamilla-Ham. My question is about the possibility that the U.S. pulls out of NAFTA. The Mexican government has stated that it might reduce security cooperation if this happens. How credible is that warning? To what extent is the Peña Nieto government just bluffing but not really willing to reduce security cooperation? Thank you.
Good morning, Sanjin Choi, Langham Partners. Ambassador Sakon, you mentioned about the two key issues for NAFTA, sixth round. You mentioned first sunset clause, second is rules of origin, but you have not touched upon issues of dispute settlement. And Ambassador Wilson just mentioned about WTO issues. So I would be very interested in your views. And Ambassador Wilson, you're also finance minister under Brian Mulroney's administration. So would you offer your views on how UK will deal with Brexit exchange EU? At least it appeared to me they made first round tentative agreement. So next year they have to deal with an EU trade agreement. It appeared to me single market is out, custom union is out. Is there any UK lessons from you how you, Canada, made a free trade agreement with the European Union? Thank you very much.
Okay.
Two parts, for two questions. One, what happens if the U.S. pulls out? It's a very interesting question. My understanding is policy of the government of Canada, I think it's the Mexican government, but I can't speak for that, is that NAFTA will continue. There's provision for NAFTA to continue without a member country. So we would be continuing to work with Mexico. And if that's the case, Mexico would have advantages coming into Canada, and likewise Canadians coming into Mexico, which the neighbor in the middle would not have. And that is going to create some tension, I would have thought, within this country, particularly in the agricultural sector. So that's something that a point that I think needs to be made. The dispute settlement in 1987 at 8:15 p.m. I personally told Jim Baker that we had real problems with what the United States was proposing. And we finally got an agreement because he realized that we were not going to have a deal if we didn't have a dispute settlement mechanism. And he overrode, he took a strategic view, and I made this strategic point earlier, so I won't repeat that, but he took a strategic view that it was important for the United States to have an agreement with Canada, a trade agreement with Canada, and he overrode his negotiating team, which were taking the same position that is currently being taken by the United States in this. So that's one lesson, that the people at the strategic level do have an ultimate responsibility to get a deal if they see the deal is appropriate for their country. And I think that we can easily come up with that combination. We've got professional negotiators, they can come up there. Now, what are the lessons learned? There's been work done analyzing what's happened with the dispute settlement mechanism. And in some cases, the United States wins. In some cases, the Canadians win. But they are small amounts in terms of the overall trade relationship between the two countries. Very small amounts. And I hesitate to say this in the United States, but the United States is a somewhat more litigious country than Canada is. And I can tell by some nodding of the heads that there's a little bit of agreement on that. So there were more challenges from the United States, and people will say that, okay, that shows that the system is working in Canada's favor. I would say it's working exactly like the system should work, so that we take the litigious, politically, sometimes politically motivated actions and reduce those to an objective arbitration where we have some independent, outside of both of our countries, some independent result or some independent participation. And that then comes up with a reasonable solution. And I would say that people who look at these from an objective, reasonable way, without trying to put numbers on things, they could say these, the decisions that have been taken have been good. So I won't say anything more than that, except it was extraordinarily important for us because you know some of the politically motivated actions that have been taken, and some actions currently between Boeing and Bombardier, which it was outside the normal trade dispute procedures. We have to have some protection against that. The United States is a lot bigger than both Mexico and Canada, and if we're going to not be disadvantaged because of that size and the litigious nature, then we have to have that balancing item, which is the dispute settlement mechanism.
I'll address the two respective issues on NAFTA first and then go to the Mexico-specific question. As Mike just said, Mexico and Canada have one thing in common. We both live next to an elephant, but it's much better to be on top of the elephant than underneath the elephant.
What one of my previous predecessors used to say is that there are too much bush and hills between us. Excuse me, Carla.
There's no doubt, and I didn't mention dispute resolution mechanisms and government procurement, simply expediency of time, but there's no doubt that the Canada round in January will hinge upon the four most contentious issues, which are rules of origin, sunset clause, which we've already discussed a bit, government procurement, and dispute resolution mechanisms. These are the four big items that could break or make the negotiation. I think the Mexican and Canadian governments in the last round here, in Mexico City, round 5, I think started responding and pushing back on some of these issues, particularly government procurement was a big one in the last round where the Mexican government put the first formal counter-proposal on the table regarding government procurement. Again, I'd remind USTR that they'd better be careful what they're wishing for on government procurement, because if Mexico were to go down the tit-for-tat route, the way we play in government procurement in the U.S. and the way the U.S. plays in government procurement in Mexico, I know who the big loser would be if this were to go down the tit-for-tat route. On the issue of what happens if there's a U.S. denunciation, both the Mexican and, I think, Canadian governments have signaled that the moment President Trump presses the nuclear button and invokes Article 2205, Mexico and Canada will walk away from the negotiating table. Because, unfortunately, I think there are some voices in Washington that think that this is a negotiating tactic, that by invoking 2205, this will force Mexico and Canada to accept some of the issues that the U.S. has put on the table. And I think that both the Mexican government, the position which I obviously know for obvious reasons better than the Canadian position, have clearly said that's the scenario where Mexico and the U.S. walk away, because there has been pressure in Mexican public opinion as some of these unpalatable my way or the highway positions by the U.S. were tabled. There were many in Mexico saying Mexico should leave the negotiating table. We're not going to do that. We're not going to hand the U.S. The excuse to torpedo an agreement by having at least Mexico, I can't speak for Canada, walk away from the negotiating table because we don't like something that has been tabled. But where I think there has been a Rubicon drawn is if the U.S. does denunciate, then Canada and Mexico will walk away. As Michael said, Mexico, this doesn't mean that NAFTA is over for Mexico and Canada. We can maintain NAFTA. In fact, I think the position of Mexico from the outset was to ensure that this was always a trilateral negotiation, despite some go-it-alone voices in Canada that were suggesting that Canada should strike its own deal with the U.S. because of fear of Mexicanization of their bilateral agenda with the United States. I think the Mexican and Canadian positions now have converged that we will continue to always ensure that there's a trilateral discussion and approach. And obviously, NAFTA would still be enforced for both Canada and Mexico, despite a U.S. denunciation. So, and Mike has talked about some of the impacts this would have. Whether the Mexican government is bluffing or not, I don't know. You should ask them. I think it's in earnest. I think there would be significant political pressures in Mexico not to respond to a unilateral denunciation of NAFTA. But at the same time, let's be real, there are direct consequences of toning down, dialing down day-to-day collaboration with U.S. law enforcement and intelligence agencies. In the fight against organized crime, for example, Mexico has depended on intel support from the United States, particularly in terms of signals intelligence, to confront organized crime. But I think there has been a paradigmatic shift that has occurred in Mexico, and I think people in Washington would be making a mistake if they don't consider this, which is for decades, for the many, I'm a career diplomat and I'm a U.S. hand, which means I've done all my diplomatic career in regards to the U.S.-Mexico bilateral relationship. Since NAFTA, the key paradigm with which Mexico and the United States engage one another is that we would not contaminate the bilateral relationship as a whole because of singular specific disputes in different issues of the bilateral agenda. The logic being that this was such a complex, many-part moving relationship that if we disagreed on tomatoes and used that to leverage security collaboration, the whole relationship would stall. So for 20 years, the paradigm that drove the U.S.-Mexico relationship was non-contamination and keeping the thematic silos so that disagreements in one area would not contaminate the agenda as a whole. After a lot of prodding and pressure, because it was the only way for a country with power asymmetry like the one that we have with the United States to sort of more or less level the playing field, was after much prodding, this government articulated a policy of linkage as a result of the pressures on NAFTA. That is, that Mexico would be approaching the negotiation related to NAFTA as a whole of bilateral relationship approach, and that we would be putting issues of security collaboration, immigration enforcement on our southern border, and others on the table to leverage and level the playing field with the United States. Whether the Mexican government does or does not do that at the end of the day, I don't know. But what I can tell you is that there will be very important public and political pressure for the Mexican government now that it has stated that as its negotiating position, to do so if it decides not to do it once NAFTA collapses.
So first, just to take off from where Arturo left, there's also a very practical question about security cooperation between the two countries. Early this year, the U.S. government, under the Trump administration, and the Mexican government designed a new strategy for combating drug trafficking and organized crime. It's going after every point along the chain of drugs, from production to the sale, production, crossing the border, the sale, the money coming back. If you're going to successfully implement that kind of cooperation, you need to have more information exchanges, more trust, and more confidence between the workers on both sides, in both governments. All those agencies have to be comfortable with each other. I don't believe that's going to be possible if we're in a situation where the two countries are distancing themselves from each other on a project that involves millions of workers in Mexico and is going to have such high cost. And additionally, where Mexico is being maligned, as it has been maligned. And it's going to be on two levels. The one level is the one that Arturo laid out, the political level, and the other level is just going to be from the point of view of the actors who have to implement this. Why am I endangering myself going after this powerful, wealthy, killing machine of a drug trafficking group for people who are calling us murderers and criminals and rapists and other things? And it's just going to dampen hope of getting to that higher level. There'll be continued cooperation. There's no doubt about that, because it's in the interests of both countries. But to get to a new level of cooperation to be more effective is going to be very, very, very difficult, I believe. And just to take up a bit on the rules of origin issue, it's very interesting. The proposal put forward by the United States has succeeded in uniting U.S. industry, Mexico, and Canada, all in their opposition to it. And their statement of, we don't really understand where it came from and how it's going to improve jobs. In fact, A study by the auto parts industry said it's going to cost up to 20,000, 25,000 U.S. jobs. And so even in this key area, there's clearly a lot of need for getting better analysis, working through the facts, working together to find a solution to this complex problem. And there may be indeed a solution where you can tinker with the rules of origin and you can have more North American content. But you really have to understand the economics of it and the industries and getting together. So right now you have U.S. industry saying, boy, this is a dangerous proposal. And we have to somehow, in a number of these areas, get beyond where we are right now to a really serious negotiation that indeed is talking about win-win-win, not win, lose-lose.
And let me just piggyback on what Tony has said, because I don't think that what we're facing here is Mexico and the United States going back to a relationship like the one that we had when the U.S. invaded Mexico in the 19th century. But it is going back to the days when Alan Riding wrote his book, Distant Neighbors, where the relationship was at best tetchy. And so the choice is, do we go back to what this relationship looked in the 70s and 80s? Or do we continue to slowly build upon this huge paradigmatic shift that occurred, driven by first NAFTA and then the national security imperatives of 9/11, and that's what's at stake here.
Okay, we have time for...
Make one, just because both Tony and Arturo have talked about that. I want to make one very important point here. The U.S.-Canada national security relationship has been extraordinarily strong, and I probably am on the right track when I say I don't think that is going to be undermined by the loss of NAFTA. It's more important. There's overriding importance to maintain that. But what I worry about, and I touched on this earlier in my comments, I worry about more the North American, call it an opportunity lost. We've seen terrific work happening in the last 15, 20 years between Mexico and the United States. And that has benefited us in Canada as well. We worry about the opportunity lost if some of the things that Arturo and Tony have talked about do happen with the loss of Mexico.
We have time for two quick questions. The gentleman over there and the gentleman over here.
Hi there, my name is Anshu. I'm a reporter with Inside U.S. Trade. Thank you to the panel for being here. Ambassador Sarkar, I know you touched on the TPP-11 briefly, or the CPTPP, however you want to call it. I wanted to know, so obviously Mexico and Canada are parties to that agreement. The United States is not. What does the panel think are the implications for the U.S. North America of TPP-11, and how will that affect Mexico and Canada's strategy as they negotiate NAFTA, they're being parties to that deal?
Well, we would just Canadian. We're going to get to the question. Hold on.
Sorry to interrupt. My name is Diego. I want to address this question to Arturo too. We've heard talks about compromise on, for example, in the sunset clause, they talked about a periodic review of the agreement. We've heard about compromise on on Chapter 19 with opt-in mediation. Can we expect something similar regarding the rules of origin dispute?
Let me just comment on the TPP-11. Canada would be very anxious to continue on the discussions on that. As we have done with CETA, with our agreement with Europe, we would be looking to expand the external relationships that we have, and TPP-11 would be very much a part of that.
I think both Mexico, one of the reasons why I think Mexico and Canada have been so emphatic in continuing to move forward with TPP-1, as we saw in the recent APEC summit, is not only because we profoundly believe in the agenda that we were despite the hurdles and despite some of the issues that caused heartburn in the TPP negotiations. I think Mexico and Canada truly believe that TPP would deliver a 21st century rules-based trading paradigm, which we think is important for the competitiveness and economic well-being of both countries. It also fits nicely into what Mexico has been doing with the Pacific Alliance, with its Chilean, Colombian, and Peruvian partners. It's all part of this growing new multilateral trading arc in the Americas, if you wish. It's our own version of a free trade coalition of the willing, if you like. But now with the discussion about the probability of President Trump pressing the nuclear button, probably even as soon as the sixth round in Canada, this becomes a plan B. It's one of the reasons why Mexico has been looking at Argentinian and Brazilian markets for grains and meat, why it has deepened the discussions with Canada in these sectors, why we're about to conclude the modernization and upgrade of our all 17, 18-year-old free trade agreement with the European Union, and where TPP plays an important role, which is precisely if we have to have a plan B, this is a very important piece of that equation. So I think that's how you should be thinking of how Mexico looks at TPP -1 in the coming weeks and months. Are there compromises possible? Yes, in principle, of course there are. But I think that in many ways, some of the willingness that you've seen, at least from Mexico's side, particularly as it relates to this review instead of a sunset clause every 5 years, is because Mexico is trying to prove that it's the adult in the bilateral relationship with the United States, that it's behaving like an adult in the negotiations and in the conversation. I think there is room for compromise. There could be some room for compromise on rules of origin, but again, it will be contingent on the US and USTR jettisoning their Sinatra doctrine of my way or the highway, and this zero-sum approach that, it's either I get everything in a maximalist approach, this idea of 50% US content within the heightened North American content for automotives, which is not going to go anywhere. That's where you're not going to see a compromise. But I think that there are areas, and you've seen it in telco and in e-commerce, where the parties are moving forward, where there could be an early harvest of success stories precisely in this intersessional session here in DC, if they can wrap up some of those chapters where they're very close to achieving closure. My hope with that would send an important message as to no, the US and Canada, despite some voices in USTR, aren't playing to wind the clock down. I think it's in nobody's interest to wind the clock down, to play with the clock and kick the can down the road. But concessions and compromises will be possible if the type of approach that the US has brought to the table from round one is jettisoned.
Okay, time has run out. Thank you so much for coming, and for our panelists and for Ambassador Hills. And please give me a round of applause. Thank you.